1945, and Germany has lost World War II. The German conquest of Europe had made allies out of the democratic West and communist East. However, this wouldn't last. The USSR, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, didn't trust the West and refused to pull out of the European territory that they had occupied during the war. To ensure the safety of the country, Stalin established communist puppet states in Eastern Europe, which would deter aggression from Western powers. It was at this time that British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. The epicenter of all this conflict was Germany's capital, Berlin. After the war, the Soviets surrounded and occupied Berlin, but not all the city itself. Tensions began to grow as the USSR and the West threatened each other and feared for a new war. Determined to bring all of Berlin under communist rule, Stalin ordered a blockade of Berlin, which would pressure the West to get out. This put the West in a difficult position as they wanted to maintain their grip on Berlin without causing full-scale conflict. Eventually, the Allies counteracted Stalin's blockade by flying supplies into the city to what became known as the Berlin Airlift. The operation was a rousing success for the Western Allies and allowed them to stay in Berlin while defending Western democracy. The late 1940s was a busy time in Cold War politics. 1. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was signed into being to strengthen the Western Allies. 2. The US carried out the Marshall Plan, sending over $12 billion to Western Europe for its economic recovery. 3. The USSR took advantage of the new technology of nuclear weapons and quickly built themselves an arsenal. This led to even more tensions as the US, under President Harry Truman, announced the Truman Doctrine as they sought to continue the spread of communism around the world. The early 1950s saw the rise of new communist states, such as the People's Republic of China in 1949. After a brutal 10-year-long civil war, the communists under Mao Zedong kicked out the old Republic of China and established the PRC. The USSR had a powerful new ally. The rise of communism in Asia continued as demonstrated by the Korean War, as UN forces fought to stop the communist takeover of Korea. But the war ultimately ended in a stalemate, dividing the peninsula between communist North and non-communist South, where it remains to this day. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died, which led to the rise of Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. He ruled a little differently from Stalin, totally ditching Stalin's cult of personality policy for more openness, but not that much. The 1950s also saw the rise of the first set of revolutions against communist rule in the Eastern Bloc, the most notable being in East Germany, Poland, and Hungary, all of which were brutally suppressed. Technological advances in the world continued the growing tensions between East and West, the creation of hydrogen bombs being one of them. The most famous event happened in 1957 when Russia launched the world's first artificial satellite into space, codenamed Sputnik 1. America was not fond of the Soviets' advancement in technology, so US President Dwight D. Eisenhower created NASA to compete with the Russians, and so began the space race. Contrary to popular belief, the race wasn't actually to get to the moon, but to test military technology. In 1961, the Soviets made history again by becoming the first nation to achieve manned spaceflight after sending Yuri Gagarin into space. This forced the Americans to rethink their plan, and after a whole decade of preparation, America won the space race by sending Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon. Back in the USSR, Khrushchev's premiership continued to be plagued with ups and downs. Despite promoting a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West, tensions were still ongoing. At the beginning of the decade, we see a decline in leadership. Khrushchev's poor handling of the U-2 crisis, we saw the US conduct spy missions over the USSR despite its threats. A tense standoff at Checkpoint Charlie in which US and Soviet tanks almost turned into a heated incident. And one of the biggest defeats was the breaking of ties with the PRC in 1961, which became known as the Sino-Soviet split. 1961 will also see the rise of the Berlin Wall to prevent the spread of Eastern Germans to the West, as it's a more anti-communist sentiment. One of the biggest events of his premiership, and the Cold War in general, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that's for next episode.